The industrial kitchen at the back of the Sterling estate was a place most guests never saw, a world of stainless steel counters and humming refrigeration units, fluorescent light bouncing off polished metal in a way that made everything feel colder and sharper than the marble halls just beyond its doors. It was here, among the clatter of dishes and the low hum of walk-in coolers, that Naomi spent most of her days, one of a dozen staff members who kept the Sterling household running smoothly without ever being seen by the family whose lives depended on that invisible labor. She had worked in service for 6 years, first in restaurants and now in private households, and she had learned, the way most people in her position eventually learn, that survival often meant becoming as unnoticeable as the walls around her. Damien Sterling had built his fortune the hard way, clawing his way up from a modest logistics company to an empire that now touched real estate, shipping, and hospitality across 3 continents. He was known in business circles for his precision, his relentless work ethic, and a personal life that had, until recently, been kept carefully out of the tabloids. That changed when he became engaged to Isabel Marchetti, a woman whose family occupied a rarefied corner of old money society, her beauty and charm making her a fixture at every gala and charity dinner worth attending. To the outside world, they were a striking couple, the self-made billionaire and the effortlessly elegant socialite, but within the walls of the Sterling estate, the staff had already begun to whisper about a different version of Isabel, one far less polished than the version presented to photographers. It began, as these things often do, with small cruelties easy to dismiss. Isabel would criticize the way silverware was arranged, insist that certain staff members be reassigned because their presence irritated her, snap at anyone who moved too slowly or too quickly for her taste. Naomi had borne the brunt of this more than most, in part because her station in the kitchen put her directly in Isabel's path whenever the woman wandered back to inspect preparations for whatever event was being hosted that week. Naomi had learned to keep her head down, to answer only when spoken to absorb the sharp comments without reaction, because she needed this job, needed the steady paycheck that supported her younger sister's college tuition, and she had long ago decided that swallowing pride was a small price to pay for stability. On the afternoon everything changed. The kitchen was preparing for a dinner Damien was hosting for a group of overseas investors, a night he had spent weeks organizing with a kind of meticulous attention he brought to every major deal. Isabel had wandered into the kitchen unannounced, restless and irritable after an argument earlier that day with her mother over wedding preparations, and she had fixated almost immediately on a minor error, a tray of appetizers arranged slightly differently than she had specified during an earlier walkthrough. She found Naomi near the walk-in cooler, double-checking inventory, and the confrontation that followed happened so quickly that Naomi barely had time to register what was occurring before it was already underway. Isabel's voice rose first, sharp and accusatory, demanding to know why her instructions had been ignored, why after everything she had explained that morning the tray still looked wrong. Naomi tried to explain calmly that the head chef had made a last-minute adjustment based on dietary requests from one of the guests, but Isabel was not interested in explanations. Something in her seemed to snap entirely, years of simmering frustration and entitlement boiling over into something neither of them expected. She stepped forward and grabbed Naomi by the throat, pinning her hard against the steel door of the walk-in cooler, her fingers pressing into skin, her face inches from Naomi's, spitting words about respect and knowing one's place that Naomi would remember with painful clarity long after the moment had passed. Naomi's hands flew up instinctively, not fighting back so much as trying to create space, her eyes wide with a fear that came not just from the physical grip but from the sudden, dizzying realization of how quickly kindness could curdle into violence when someone believed there would be no consequences. Neither woman noticed Damien standing in the doorway. He had come to the kitchen himself, an unusual choice for a man who typically left such matters to his staff, but he had wanted to personally confirm the evening's menu given how much rode on tonight's dinner. He had pushed open the door expecting the familiar bustle of preparation, and instead found himself frozen mid-step, watching the woman he had proposed to just months earlier with her hand around the throat of a member of his household staff. For a moment, his mind refused to fully process what his eyes were showing him, the scene so at odds with the image of Isabel he had carried for the better part of a year that it took several seconds for shock to give way to something colder and more decisive. He did not shout, though every instinct told him to. He crossed the kitchen floor in a handful of quick strides and gripped Isabel's wrist, not roughly, but with enough firm pressure to make clear the moment was over. Isabel released Naomi immediately, spinning around with wide eyes, her expression shifting in an instant from fury to something closer to panic as she registered exactly who had witnessed what she had just done. She began speaking rapidly, words tumbling over each other, insisting that Naomi had provoked her, that the girl had been careless and disrespectful, that Damien didn't understand the pressure she'd been under all day. Damien said nothing to her at first. He turned instead to Naomi, who stood with one hand pressed lightly against her own throat, breathing unevenly, her eyes still wide with the residue of fear. He asked her, gently, if she was all right, his voice carrying none of the sharp authority he was known for in boardrooms, only a quiet, careful concern that surprised even the other staff members who had gathered near the kitchen entrance, drawn by the commotion. Naomi, still too stunned to fully form words, managed only a small nod, though her trembling hands told a more honest story than her silence did. It was only after ensuring Naomi was safely seated and given water that Damien turned back to Isabel, and the change in his expression was enough to silence whatever explanation she had been building. He asked her plainly whether what he had just witnessed was truly how she treated people who couldn't defend themselves, whether the woman he had spent months planning a future with was capable of putting her hands around another person's throat over the placement of appetizers. Isabel, desperate now, reached for his arm, insisting this wasn't who she really was, that she had simply lost her temper, that surely one moment shouldn't define an entire relationship. But Damien had already begun connecting the dots he had spent months refusing to see, remembering now the staff who had quietly requested transfers away from Isabel's presence, the housekeeper who had resigned abruptly 2 months earlier without explanation, the pattern he had been too consumed by work and infatuation to notice until this single, undeniable moment forced it into focus. He told her, with a calm that unsettled her more than shouting would have, that their engagement was over, that he could not and would not build a life with someone capable of the violence he had just witnessed, regardless of whatever pressures or excuses she offered. Isabel's composure shattered completely, her voice rising into something between pleading and outrage, reminding him of the wedding plans already underway, the guest list already finalized, the embarrassment such a public reversal would cause both their families. Damien, unmoved, told her that public embarrassment mattered far less to him than the safety and dignity of the people who worked in his home, and that he would rather face every uncomfortable conversation with investors and society columns than spend one more day pretending not to see who she truly was. He asked security to escort Isabel from the property that same evening, canceling the dinner with the investors entirely, a decision that would cost him professionally in ways he understood clearly even in the moment, but one he made without hesitation. As Isabel was led away, still protesting, still insisting this could all be smoothed over, Damien returned to the kitchen, where the rest of the staff had quietly resumed their work, though the air remained heavy with the residue of what had just happened. He found Naomi still seated near the counter, a cup of water untouched in front of her, and he pulled up a chair across from her, something he had never done in 6 years of employing kitchen staff he barely knew by name. He apologized, plainly and without excuse, for not seeing sooner what had apparently been happening under his own roof, and Naomi, still shaken, told him honestly that she hadn't wanted to say anything, that speaking up against someone in Isabel's position had never felt safe, not when her job and her sister's tuition depended on staying quiet. Damien listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her that from this point forward, no one in his household would ever again be made to feel that silence was the price of safety. In the weeks that followed, Damien made sweeping changes throughout the estate, instituting clear channels for staff to report mistreatment without fear of retaliation, raising wages across the board, and personally checking in with employees in a way he had never bothered to before. He found himself returning to the kitchen more often than his schedule strictly required, not out of any particular need, but because he had discovered, almost accidentally, that the conversations he had there felt more honest than most of what filled his days in boardrooms and business dinners. Naomi, still cautious after the trauma of what had happened, kept their interactions professional at first, uncertain whether his sudden attentiveness reflected genuine change or simply the guilt of a man confronting his own blindness. But Damien's consistency, week after week, began to wear down her caution. He remembered small details she mentioned in passing, followed through on promises he made about improving staff conditions, and never once used his position to pressure her into more familiarity than she was ready for. Slowly, cautiously, something began to grow between them that neither had anticipated, built not on grand gestures but on the accumulation of small, honest moments, a shared laugh over a kitchen mishap, a quiet conversation on the back steps after a long shift, the particular ease of two people who had both learned, in different ways, the value of paying close attention to the people around them. It was nearly a year after that terrible afternoon in the kitchen that Damien finally acknowledged aloud what had been growing between them, choosing not a grand gesture in front of cameras, but a quiet evening in the very kitchen where their story had so unexpectedly begun. telling her that the worst moment of his life had somehow led him toward the most honest relationship he had ever known. Naomi, still careful even in her happiness, reminded him gently that trust took time to rebuild after what she had experienced, and Damien, understanding this more deeply than she perhaps realized, told her he intended to spend as much time as she needed proving that safety and respect weren't conditions he offered only when convenient, but the foundation of everything he now wanted to build. Their relationship unfolded slowly over the following months, largely outside the public eye Damien had once inhabited so easily, both of them preferring the quiet honesty of a life built on genuine partnership over the performative glamour that had defined his engagement to Isabel. Naomi finished a business certification program Damien had quietly funded without ever making her feel it was charity rather than genuine belief in her abilities, and she began taking on more responsibility within the household's operations, not because of her relationship with Damien but because her competence had simply become impossible to overlook once people finally started paying attention. Isabel, for her part, largely disappeared from the social circles that had once celebrated her, the video captured by a staff member's phone that day having circulated just enough within their social world to permanently alter how she was perceived among people who valued appearances above almost everything else. Damien rarely spoke of her publicly, preferring instead to focus on the changes he had made within his own household and business practices, changes that extended eventually to a foundation he established supporting labor protections for domestic and service workers, a project inspired directly by everything Naomi had taught him about the invisible weight so many people carried simply to survive. Years later, when interviewers occasionally asked Damien about the incident that had ended his engagement so publicly, he answered honestly, without the practiced deflection so common among people of his wealth and position, saying simply that it had taken witnessing cruelty firsthand to understand how much he had been failing to see, and that the woman standing beside him now had taught him more about genuine strength and dignity than anyone else in his life ever had. Naomi, when asked, rarely elaborated much beyond acknowledging that healing had taken time, that trust once broken required patience to rebuild, but that she had come to believe, against everything years of quiet service had taught her to expect, that sometimes the people with the most power were also capable of the most meaningful change, if only someone finally gave them a reason to look closely enough to see it.